I never meant for that footage to go public. I recorded it during a routine patrol flight over the Cascade foothills in Washington state, and for 3 weeks it sat on my hard drive while I tried to convince myself I had misidentified what I saw. When it finally leaked online, probably through someone at the FAA or the Forest Service, my life changed in ways I'm still trying to process. My name is Michael Torres. I'm 52 years old, and I've been flying helicopters for 28 years. I spent 6 years in the Army flying Blackhawks, then another 22 doing contract work for the Forest Service, search and rescue operations, and private surveying companies. I've logged over 8,000 flight hours across the Pacific Northwest, Alaska, and parts of Canada. I've seen bears, elk, wolves, and every kind of wildlife this region has to offer. I know what animals look like from the air, how they move, how they react to rotor noise. What I recorded that afternoon in October wasn't any of those things, and I've stopped trying to pretend it was. The flight itself was unremarkable at first. I was contracted by a timber company to survey potential logging sites in a remote section of national forest about 40 miles northeast of Mount Rainier. The area was dense old growth mixed with second-growth timber, cut through by seasonal creeks and punctuated by small clearings where lightning strikes or disease had opened up the canopy. It was a Tuesday, mid-afternoon, with clear skies and excellent visibility, the kind of conditions that make surveying work easy and efficient. The temperature was cool but comfortable, maybe 55 degrees at ground level, and the air was stable with minimal turbulence. I had a high-definition camera mounted on a stabilized gimbal underneath the aircraft, recording continuous footage for the client's review. The setup was standard for this kind of work, providing detailed overhead imagery that surveyors and foresters would analyze later to plan access roads, identify valuable timber stands, and assess terrain challenges. I'd done dozens of similar flights without incident, covering hundreds of square miles of Pacific Northwest wilderness. I'd been flying the survey pattern for about 90 minutes when I first noticed something unusual. I was following a predetermined grid, moving methodically across the landscape at about 800 feet above ground level, maintaining a speed of roughly 40 knots. The camera was recording continuously, capturing every detail of the terrain below. Most of what I saw was exactly what I expected: dense coniferous forest, occasional clearings, the silver threads of creeks cutting through the green canopy, and scattered areas where logging operations from decades past had left visible scars that were slowly being reclaimed by new growth. Wildlife sightings were common on these flights. I'd see elk herds bedded down in meadows, black bears foraging along creek beds, occasionally a cougar moving through the shadows, though they were rare and usually just quick glimpses. The animals almost always reacted to the helicopter the same way. They'd look up briefly, assess the noise source, and then either freeze in place or move away quickly depending on their temperament and how exposed they felt. I was flying over a section of particularly dense forest when I noticed movement in a clearing ahead and to my left. My first thought was elk. The clearing was roughly circular, maybe 60 yards across, surrounded by dense conifers that rose like walls around the open space. The ground inside the clearing appeared to be a mix of low grass and scattered brush, typical of areas where the canopy had opened up and allowed more sunlight to reach the forest floor. But something about the movement pattern caught my attention before I'd even focused on what was moving. It was too coordinated, too deliberate, with a rhythm that didn't match the scattered panic of elk or the lumbering gait of bears. I slowed the helicopter and brought it into a stable hover, adjusting the camera angle to point directly at the clearing below. The gimbal system responded smoothly, and the high-definition feed appeared on my cockpit monitor, showing me exactly what the camera was capturing. What I saw through that feed made my hands tighten on the controls and my breath catch in my throat. There were 4 figures in the clearing, 2 large, 2 smaller. They were upright, walking on 2 legs with a gait that was fluid and natural, not the awkward shuffle of a bear standing briefly on its hind legs for a better view of its surroundings. Even from 800 feet, I could see they were covered in dark fur that looked almost black in the afternoon sunlight, and they had proportions that didn't match anything I knew. The larger 2 stood maybe 7 or 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders that tapered to narrower waists. Their arms were long, hanging naturally at their sides as they walked, moving with the kind of relaxed swing that comes from habitual bipedal movement. The smaller ones, probably juveniles based on their size and the way they stayed close to the larger figures, were perhaps 5 feet tall, moving with the same bipedal ease as the adults. Their movements were coordinated and purposeful, not the random wandering of animals grazing or foraging, but directed travel as if they were crossing the clearing to reach a specific destination on the other side. I've seen bears stand up hundreds of times during my years of flying. This wasn't that. Bears are bulky and bottom-heavy when upright, with their weight centered low in their hips and legs. Their arms hang down limply when they stand because they're built for quadrupedal movement, and the forelimbs aren't structured to swing naturally while walking on 2 legs. Bears drop back to all fours after a few seconds because bipedal movement is awkward and unstable for them. It's something they do briefly to get a better view or to appear larger when threatened, not something they can maintain while traveling any distance. These figures moved like bipedal locomotion was natural, comfortable, their default state of movement. Their arms swung at their sides in rhythm with their steps. Their heads turned smoothly to scan their surroundings as they walked. They moved across the clearing with the kind of easy confidence that comes from bodies designed for upright travel, not adapted to it temporarily. I kept the helicopter in a stable hover, making micro-adjustments with the cyclic and collective to compensate for the slight breeze that was starting to pick up. The camera remained locked on the clearing, the stabilization system doing its job perfectly, recording everything in crisp detail. The adults stopped near the center of the clearing and appeared to be examining something on the ground. One of them bent down in a movement that was smooth and controlled, knees bending, back straight, exactly the way a human would crouch to pick something up. I saw what looked like hands rather than paws reaching toward whatever had their attention. The fingers, or digits, appeared elongated but functional, capable of grasping and manipulation. The other adult remained standing but turned its body to face in multiple directions as if keeping watch while its companion focused on the ground. The juveniles stayed close to the adults, occasionally moving a few steps away to investigate something that caught their interest, but always returning to proximity after a few moments. The behavior reminded me powerfully of a family group, parents with offspring, moving through familiar territory with the kind of casual confidence that comes from knowing an area intimately. The more I watched, the more details emerged that contradicted any conventional explanation. The way they held their heads slightly forward on their necks but balanced and controlled wasn't quite human and wasn't quite canine, but something in between. The way their bodies moved showed muscle structure and joint articulation that allowed for smooth bipedal travel without the awkward compensations that animals like bears have to make. Their posture was upright but relaxed, not the rigid forced stance of an animal temporarily on 2 legs, and the coordination between the 4 of them, the way the juveniles stayed close to the adults, the way one adult watched while the other examined the ground, all suggested social structure and communication that went beyond simple animal instinct. Then, one of the adults looked up, not a random glance at the sky, not the startled jerk of an animal hearing an unexpected sound, but a direct, focused turn of the head toward my exact position. The camera captured the moment with perfect clarity, and I watched it happen in real time on my monitor while simultaneously seeing it through the windscreen of the helicopter. The head was large and distinctly canine, with a pronounced muzzle that extended forward from the face and pointed ears that rotated independently, swiveling slightly as if fine-tuning their focus on the source of the rotor noise. But the way it held its head, the angle of its gaze, the absolute stillness of its posture as it stared upward, all suggested awareness and intelligence that exceeded anything I'd seen in wildlife. It wasn't startled by the helicopter noise. It was studying the source of that noise, evaluating it, making decisions about what it meant and how to respond. The rotor wash at 800 feet wouldn't have reached the ground with much force, just a gentle downward breeze that might stir the grass slightly, but wouldn't create the dramatic downdraft you see in movies when helicopters hover at low altitude. But the sound would have been loud and obvious, a steady rhythmic thumping that carries for miles in open country. Most wildlife reacts to helicopter noise by fleeing immediately. Elk scatter in multiple directions, their herding instinct breaking down under the stress of something large and loud approaching from above. Bears run for tree cover, moving with surprising speed despite their bulk. Even wolves, which are relatively bold and less prone to panic than prey animals, move away quickly when aircraft approach, disappearing into the densest available cover. These figures didn't run. They didn't show any signs of panic or fear. The adult that had looked up held its gaze on my position for several long seconds, and I had the distinct impression it was making eye contact with me, even across the distance and through the glass of my windscreen. Then it raised one arm in a gesture that looked deliberate and communicative. The arm came up smoothly from its side, the hand or paw visible at the end of the limb, and seemed to gesture in my direction or toward the others in the clearing. I couldn't tell if it was pointing at me specifically or simply indicating my presence to the rest of the group, but the movement was too controlled and purposeful to be random. The second adult turned its head upward as well, following the first one's gaze, and both juveniles moved closer to the adults in a response that looked like trained behavior or instinctual family bonding during a potential threat. Then, in a coordinated movement that suggested clear communication and group decision-making, all four of them turned and walked calmly toward the tree line on the far side of the clearing. They didn't panic. They didn't scatter in different directions the way animals do when they're truly frightened. They moved together as a unit with clear purpose and control, maintaining their spacing, keeping the juveniles between the two adults, walking with the same fluid bipedal gait they'd shown throughout the encounter. I watched them reach the edge of the clearing and step into the shadows beneath the trees. The transition was remarkable. One moment they were visible in the sunlight of the open area, dark shapes against the green and brown of the ground cover. The next moment they were gone, absorbed into the forest, as if they'd never existed. The tree line swallowed them completely, and despite the excellent visibility and the high-definition camera, I couldn't detect any further movement or see any indication of where they'd gone. It was as if the forest had accepted them back, closing around them like water, closing over something that had briefly broken the surface. I continued hovering over the clearing for another 2 minutes, the camera still recording, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. Nothing emerged. The forest was still and quiet, at least from my perspective 800 feet above it. I couldn't hear the normal sounds of the woods from that altitude over the rotor noise, but visually everything appeared calm and undisturbed. The clearing itself showed no evidence that anything unusual had occurred. No disturbed ground that I could see from above, no broken vegetation, just an empty circle of grass and brush surrounded by dense conifers. I marked the GPS coordinates in my navigation system, noting the exact latitude and longitude so I could find this location again if needed, then forced myself to continue with the survey pattern I'd been flying. I had a job to complete, and hovering over an empty clearing wasn't accomplishing anything except burning fuel and wasting the client's time. The rest of the flight passed in a state of semi-shock. I flew the remaining survey lines mechanically, my hands and feet working the controls through muscle memory while my mind kept replaying what I'd seen. I tried to focus on the task, on maintaining proper altitude and speed, on ensuring the camera was capturing the footage the timber company needed, but my thoughts kept returning to those four figures and the way they'd moved with such natural ease on two legs. The way the adult had looked directly at my position with what seemed like complete awareness. The coordinated withdrawal that suggested communication and group decision-making. By the time I completed the final survey line and turned back toward the staging area where I'd taken off that morning, I'd almost convinced myself I'd imagined details that weren't really there, that stress or fatigue or the angle of observation had distorted what I'd actually seen. The flight back took about an hour, following the valleys and ridgelines I knew well from years of flying this region. The afternoon light was starting to take on that golden quality that comes in the hours before sunset, painting the mountains in warm tones and casting long shadows across the landscape. Under normal circumstances, I would have enjoyed the scenery, would have taken pleasure in the simple act of flying through this beautiful country. But my mind was elsewhere, churning through possibilities and explanations, trying to find some rational framework that would make sense of what I'd recorded. Maybe it was people in costumes. Maybe it was a film crew shooting something in a remote location, and I'd stumbled onto their set without realizing it. But that didn't explain the remoteness of the area, which was miles from any road or trail. It didn't explain the complete absence of any vehicles, equipment, camera crews, or support infrastructure that would be necessary for filming in such a location. It didn't explain the fluid natural movement of the figures, which showed none of the restrictions or awkwardness that costumes would impose. And it certainly didn't explain the size of the adults, which exceeded what any normal human could achieve, even with platform shoes and prosthetics. People in costumes would have waved at the helicopter. They would have acknowledged the aircraft's presence in some human way, either with excitement at being discovered or annoyance at having their shoot interrupted. They would have shown some response that indicated human consciousness and human social expectations. These figures had done none of that. They'd simply acknowledged the helicopter's presence with calm assessment and withdrawn with the kind of casual confidence that suggested they knew these woods intimately and had nothing to fear from aerial observation. The more I thought about it, the less the costume explanation made sense. Back at the staging area, I went through my post-flight routine with the kind of mechanical precision that comes from decades of repetition. I shut down the aircraft, completed my logbook entries, secured the rotor blades, and performed the standard inspection checks. Then, I downloaded the footage from the camera's storage system to my laptop, a process that took about 20 minutes given the several hours of high-definition video that had been recorded. I transferred everything to my hard drive, backed it up to a secondary drive as required by my contract, and then sat in my truck with the laptop open, scrolling through the footage until I found the clearing sequence. I watched it 3 times in a row without moving, without even realizing how much time was passing. The resolution was excellent, even better than it had appeared on the small cockpit monitor during the flight. The stabilization system had kept the camera perfectly steady despite the helicopter's small movements in the air. The lighting was ideal, strong afternoon sun illuminating the clearing from an angle that created depth and detail. Every aspect of the footage was clear, and every detail confirmed what I'd seen in real time. These were not bears. The proportions were completely wrong, the movement patterns didn't match, and the behavior was unlike anything bears do. They were not people in suits. The remoteness of the location made that impossible, and the size of the adults exceeded human scale, even accounting for costumes or stilts. They were something else, something bipedal and intelligent, moving through that forest with the ease of long familiarity. The more I studied the footage, the more small details emerged that I hadn't noticed during the actual encounter. The way the fur lay against their bodies, smooth and natural rather than bunched or artificial looking. The way their joints articulated, showing range of motion that looked biological rather than mechanical. The subtle differences between the 2 adults, one slightly larger than the other, one with slightly darker coloring, suggesting individual variation within whatever species they represented. The juveniles stayed remarkably close to the adults throughout the sequence, never wandering more than a few feet away, behavior that matched protective parenting across numerous species, but was particularly striking given the apparent intelligence these creatures demonstrated. I burned a copy of the footage to a secure drive and filed my standard report with the timber company, a detailed document describing the terrain I'd surveyed, noting the tree density and species composition, providing the GPS coordinates they'd requested for potential access roads and harvest sites. I included technical data about slope angles, soil visibility where the canopy opened up, water features that might affect logging operations. I said nothing about the figures in the clearing because I knew how it would sound. I knew the kind of ridicule that follows claims like this. I've heard the stories over the years, the jokes about Bigfoot hunters and people who claim to have seen UFOs or lake monsters. Pilots are supposed to be reliable observers, trained to notice details and report accurately. Any suggestion that I'd seen something unexplained would immediately call that reliability into question. I had no interest in becoming the subject of jokes in hangars and briefing rooms across the Pacific Northwest. For 3 weeks, I told no one. Not my wife, not my colleagues, not the friends I'd known for decades. I went about my normal routine, flying other survey missions, conducting a search and rescue operation that turned out to be a false alarm, doing maintenance work on my aircraft. But every few days I'd pull up the footage and watch it again, always hoping I'd see something I'd missed that would provide a conventional explanation. The footage never changed. 4 bipedal figures, 2 adults and 2 juveniles, moving through a remote clearing with coordination and intelligence that exceeded any known wildlife in North America. The way they carried themselves, the way they communicated through gesture and coordinated movement, the way they withdrew calmly rather than fleeing in panic, all pointed to something that possessed significant cognitive capability. I started researching in my spare time, using private browsing windows and being careful not to create any search history that might raise questions. I looked into Bigfoot sightings in Washington state first, not because I thought these were Bigfoot, but because I needed to understand what might be living in these forests that science hadn't officially recognized. What I found surprised me in its volume and consistency. Thousands of reported sightings going back over a century, concentrated in the Pacific Northwest, but extending across North America and into parts of Canada. The descriptions were remarkably consistent across time and geography. Large bipedal primates covered in hair, standing between 6 and 9 feet tall, moving through forests with apparent ease, avoiding human contact but occasionally seen by hunters, hikers, or rural residents. But the descriptions didn't match what I'd recorded. Bigfoot reports described creatures that were essentially giant apes, with flat faces and human-like features, covered in brown or reddish hair, exhibiting behavior consistent with shy forest dwellers. The figures in my footage had canine heads. I'd seen the muzzles clearly, seen the pointed ears that had rotated independently when the adult looked up at my helicopter. Their body proportions were different too, more slender through the torso, with longer arms and a different posture than the descriptions of Bigfoot suggested. Their behavior was different as well, calmer and more territorial, rather than the avoidance and retreat patterns that Bigfoot witnesses consistently reported. I expanded my research and stumbled across references to something called Dogman. The term itself sounded ridiculous, like something from a bad horror movie, but the descriptions made my blood run cold because they matched what I'd recorded almost perfectly. Bipedal canines reported primarily in Michigan, Wisconsin, and other Great Lakes states, but with scattered sightings across the entire continent. Witnesses described creatures standing between 6 and 8 feet tall with wolf-like heads, muscular builds, and dark fur. They were reported to move in family groups, display territorial behavior, and show intelligence that exceeded typical wildlife. Many of the accounts described encounters where the creatures demonstrated awareness of being observed and made deliberate choices about how to respond rather than simply reacting on instinct. I read dozens of encounter reports, most of them posted anonymously on cryptid research forums or shared in small communities of people who took these things seriously. I read accounts from hunters who'd seen dogmen watching them from tree lines, from campers who'd had their sights circled by something that moved on 2 legs and made vocalizations that didn't match any known animal, from rural residents who'd found tracks on their property that showed bipedal gait and canine paw structure. The consistency was striking. These were people from different states, different backgrounds, different time periods, all describing essentially the same thing. And all of them had been dismissed, ridiculed, or told they'd misidentified bears or other conventional animals. I understood their reluctance to come forward because I felt it myself. I had evidence that most of them lacked high-definition video footage from a stable platform with perfect lighting and clear documentation of GPS coordinates and timestamps. But that evidence meant nothing if I couldn't share it without destroying my professional credibility. I started having conversations with myself about what to do, running through scenarios in my mind. If I came forward, who would believe me? Wildlife biologists would say I'd filmed bears, despite the obvious differences. Cryptid researchers would celebrate the footage, but would be dismissed by mainstream science regardless of what I'd captured. The media would turn it into entertainment, using my footage for clickbait articles and sensational television segments that would make the whole thing seem like a joke. Then, the decision was taken out of my hands. The footage leaked. I still don't know exactly how it happened or who was responsible. I'd submitted the full survey recording to the timber company as contractually required, multiple hours of footage showing the entire flight from takeoff to landing. I'd also filed a copy with the FAA as part of standard documentation for commercial helicopter operations, a routine requirement that I'd fulfilled hundreds of times over my career. Someone at one of those organizations must have reviewed the footage, found the clearing sequence, and decided it was too significant to keep quiet. Either they shared it intentionally, or they showed it to someone who then shared it without authorization. However it happened, the video appeared online on a Cryptid research forum about 3 weeks after I'd recorded it. I found out about the leak when a friend sent me a text message with a link and a simple question asking if this was my footage. I clicked the link and felt my stomach drop. There was my video, posted by an anonymous user, with a title claiming it showed a Dogman family group in the Washington Cascades. The post had been up for less than 6 hours and already had thousands of views and hundreds of comments. People were analyzing every frame, debating whether it was real or computer-generated, arguing about the location and whether the figures were animals or people in costumes. Within 24 hours, the video had spread to YouTube, where multiple channels had re-uploaded it with varying levels of commentary and analysis. By the end of the second day, it was on Reddit, Twitter, and Facebook, being shared and discussed across thousands of threads and groups. The viral spread was exponential and unstoppable. News websites picked it up, running articles with headlines about the clearest Dogman footage ever captured. Television programs contacted Cryptid researchers for expert opinions. Online communities dedicated to unexplained phenomena dissected every second of the video, creating frame-by-frame analyses and enhancement techniques that pulled out details I hadn't even noticed myself. The view count climbed into the millions within a week. My name wasn't attached to the original leak, but it didn't take long for people to trace the footage back to me through public flight records and aircraft registration information that showed which helicopter had been operating in that area on that specific date. My phone started ringing constantly. News producers wanted interviews, documentary filmmakers wanted exclusive rights to the footage and my story. Cryptid researchers wanted to know the exact coordinates so they could organize expeditions to the area. Skeptics wanted to interrogate me about what I'd really seen and whether I'd fabricated the evidence for attention or money. I declined them all at first, letting calls go to voicemail and ignoring emails that flooded my inbox. I hoped the attention would fade, that some new viral video or news story would capture the internet's short attention span and my footage would be forgotten. But weeks passed and the interest didn't diminish. If anything, it intensified as more people discovered the video and the debate about its authenticity continued to generate engagement across social media platforms. The timber company terminated my contract. They didn't cite the footage specifically, but the timing was obvious. They sent a brief email thanking me for my service and informing me that they'd be using a different contractor for future survey work. Other clients started backing away as well, finding reasons to delay projects or go with other pilots. The aviation community is small, and reputation matters enormously. Word was getting around that I was the pilot who'd filmed the Dogman video, and companies didn't want the association or the controversy. I understood their position even as it frustrated me. They had businesses to run, and couldn't afford to have their operations become part of a cryptid story that most people dismissed as fantasy or hoax. My wife was supportive but concerned. She'd watched the footage herself multiple times and agreed that what I'd filmed didn't match any known animal, but she worried about the impact on our lives and my career. We had bills to pay, a mortgage, normal responsibilities that didn't stop just because I'd accidentally become involved in something unexplained. She asked me what I wanted to do, whether I wanted to fight back against the skepticism or just let the whole thing fade away and try to rebuild my professional reputation. I didn't have a good answer. Part of me wanted to defend what I'd seen and recorded, to insist that the footage was authentic and represented something genuinely unknown. But another part of me just wanted to go back to normal life, to fly helicopters and do my job without being known as the Dogman pilot. The attention from researchers was persistent, but at least more respectful than the media circus. Several serious cryptozoologists contacted me with thoughtful questions about the flight conditions, the camera specifications, and my observations beyond what the footage showed. They wanted to know if I'd noticed anything else unusual in the area, whether I had returned to the location, what my professional opinion was about the possibility of unknown large animals existing in remote wilderness. I found myself gradually opening up to a few of them, sharing details I hadn't mentioned publicly, describing the intelligence I'd perceived in the way the adult had looked up at my helicopter and the coordinated withdrawal of the group. One researcher in particular, a retired wildlife biologist who'd spent decades studying large predators, offered an analysis that stayed with me. He pointed out that the Pacific Northwest has millions of acres of dense forest, much of it rarely visited by humans, with terrain so rugged and remote that comprehensive surveys are essentially impossible. He noted that new species of large mammals have been discovered in recent decades in other parts of the world, places that were thought to be well explored and documented. He suggested that if a small population of unknown bipedal canines existed in the deepest wilderness, living in family groups and avoiding human contact, they could potentially remain undetected by mainstream science indefinitely. The key would be low population numbers, vast territories, and behavioral patterns that minimized contact with humans. His analysis made sense to me in a way that the more sensational explanations didn't. I wasn't interested in theories about interdimensional beings or supernatural creatures. What I'd filmed looked biological, physical, bound by the same rules of anatomy and movement that govern all living things. The creatures had been there in the clearing, occupying space, moving with purpose, existing as part of the ecosystem. They weren't ghosts or illusions. They were flesh and blood animals that happened to be unknown to science, or at least unacknowledged by official institutions. I eventually agreed to do one interview with a documentary filmmaker who'd approached me with genuine curiosity rather than sensationalism. We met at a neutral location and talked for several hours about the flight, the footage, and my background as a pilot. I explained my training and experience, walked through what I'd seen in detail, and answered his questions about camera specifications and flight parameters. He seemed primarily interested in establishing the credibility of the footage rather than making claims about what the figures were or what they meant. The resulting documentary was measured and thoughtful, presenting my account alongside analysis from wildlife experts and leaving conclusions open for viewers to make their own judgments. The response to the documentary was mixed. Believers celebrated it as vindication that dogmen were real. Skeptics dismissed it as wishful thinking based on ambiguous footage. Scientists who were willing to comment publicly generally suggested I'd filmed bears, though none of them could explain the bipedal gait or the obvious canine features visible in close analysis of the footage. The debate continued in online forums and comment sections, with no resolution and no consensus. But at least my side of the story was out there, presented accurately and without embellishment. I returned to the clearing once, about 2 months after the original sighting. I filed a flight plan for a different purpose, a general survey of a region that happened to include the coordinates where I'd seen the figures. I approached the area carefully, flying at higher altitude initially and then descending when I had visual confirmation of the clearing. It looked exactly as it had before, a circular open space surrounded by dense conifers with no visible signs of recent activity. I hovered over it for 10 minutes, the camera recording, hoping something might emerge from the tree line. Nothing did. The forest remained still and empty, at least from my perspective, hundreds of feet above it. Since then, I've accepted that I'll probably never see them again. Whatever I encountered that October afternoon was a chance observation, a brief glimpse of something that normally remains hidden. The creatures clearly understood that helicopters meant human observation and had chosen to withdraw rather than remain visible. If they possess the intelligence that their coordinated behavior suggested, they've probably altered their patterns in that area, avoiding the clearing during times when aircraft might be overhead, perhaps abandoning it entirely if they perceived it as compromised. My career has slowly recovered. Some clients have returned, willing to overlook the controversy. Others remain distant, and I've had to accept that certain opportunities are closed to me now. I've become more selective about the work I take, focusing on jobs where my reputation as a skilled pilot matters more than my association with cryptid footage. The notoriety has faded somewhat as the internet's attention has moved on to other mysteries and controversies, though the video still circulates and occasionally resurfaces when someone discovers it for the first time. I think about that encounter often, especially when I'm flying over remote wilderness. I wonder how many times I've passed over areas where these creatures were present but hidden beneath the canopy, invisible from above, living their lives in the vast spaces between human awareness. I wonder about the juveniles I saw and whether they're still alive, whether they're adults now with juveniles of their own. I wonder if the group I filmed was unique or if there are others scattered across the forests of the Pacific Northwest, maintaining populations too small and dispersed to be easily detected. What I know with certainty is that the footage is real. I recorded it with professional equipment during routine operations. The figures in that clearing were not bears, not people in costumes, not computer-generated effects or deliberate hoaxes. They were living creatures moving through their habitat with natural ease, demonstrating behavior that suggested intelligence and social organization. Whether science will ever acknowledge what I captured, I can't predict. But the footage exists, preserved and analyzed and debated. And somewhere in the forests of Washington, something walks upright that we haven't classified or studied or even officially admitted exists. I'm more careful now about what I say publicly, more aware of the professional costs of being associated with unexplained phenomena. But I haven't recanted or claimed I was mistaken. What I saw was real, and the footage documents it as clearly as technology allows. The rest is up to others to decide, to believe or dismiss according to their own judgment. I've done what I can by sharing what I recorded. The creatures themselves will remain in the wilderness, hidden and protected by vast distance and human skepticism, living as they've probably lived for thousands of years, just beyond the edge of what we're willing to acknowledge.